Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. My name is Anna Kuzman, and I am a Program Assistant at the Justice Programs Office at American University. This webinar is being brought to you in part by a grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Office of Justice Programs, U.S. Department of Justice. Before we get started, I want to go over how the webinar is going to run today. All attendees are currently muted. If you have a question throughout the webinar, please submit it using the Q&A panel located on the right side of the webinar screen. Your questions will be seen only by me, the host, and hopefully if we have a chance at the end, we'll be able to ask our presenters some of these questions if time allows. Our presenters today have a few slides where they will be asking for audience input, and you can submit your thoughts, ideas, or answers through the chat panel. You can access that panel by clicking on the icon that says chat in the top right corner of the screen. This should bring up a chat box on the right side of the webinar screen. Please be sure that when you are sending a chat, you set it to be sent to the host and presenter so that we can see it. If you have any difficulties with this, feel free to message me using the Q&A function. At the conclusion of this webinar, a brief survey will appear on your screen, and we would really appreciate it if you could fill it out as it helps us improve our future webinars. And before I introduce our presenters today, I want to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded, and that recording will be posted on the JPO YouTube channel and website. So our first presenter is Diana Padilla. Diana is a program manager for the Training Institute of NDRI and a senior staff trainer at the Northeast and Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center. She has over 20 years of public health experience, including substance abuse treatment, and has developed curriculum on behavioral health topics and culturally informed practices. Our second presenter is Joseph Madonia. Joe is a licensed clinical social worker and a credentialed alcohol and substance abuse counselor. From 2003 to 2016, Joe served as the director of the Brooklyn Treatment Court. He currently serves as a clinical associate professor at NYU's Silver School of Social Work and as a field instructor for NYU and Columbia University graduate social work programs. He also maintains a private practice where he works with young people with substance use and mental health disorders. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Do we have control now?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. Really glad to be here. I'm delighted to be co-presenting with my colleague and friend, Joe Madonia. Just to bring this up to speed, to start off right away. So why are we here? Why are we presenting on Hispanic and Latinos in drug courts? Well, the research suggests that Hispanics have better outcomes when treatments are adapted to their unique experiences, those risk and protective factors. And with the Hispanic population, many of these factors are rooted in culture. And this gives us an opportunity to share with you perhaps very light experiences and challenges, as well as how to integrate Hispanic cultural characteristics within strategies, making them culturally informed and increasing the likelihood of successful outcomes for your programs. So going forward, I think it would make sense to go over a few cultural terms and references. And for some reason, there's always been some difficulty in understanding understanding which reference to use in terms of a person from a Hispanic or Latino background. The title of this webinar started with Hispanic and Latino as opposed to Hispanic or Latino. It's more of our attempt to be inclusive. There are many definitions as to what Hispanic means and what Latino means, and there's a history behind this. The Hispanic term actually was first generated in 1970 in the 1970 census. And it was by a member of the ad hoc committee that suggested that instead of saying specifically Mexican groups or Puerto Rican groups, to kind of capture the data for the whole population so they could use Hispanic. And so Hispanic was born officially. And since then, because there's a lot of association with previously governed territories by Spain or Spanish-speaking people, which is not necessarily what Hispanic refers to, the more neutral term of Latino came up. But when you see on the left hand of the slide, a Pew Hispanic survey that was done not all that long ago, and what they did was just ask folks, what is your preference? And what it turns out to be is there are a lot of folks in this community, this population rather, would prefer Hispanic, some would prefer Latino, many don't have any particular preference. The point here is for us as practitioners, when we're working with someone from a Hispanic Latino background, is simply to ask them. What you get, and this is a big point, is that if you get someone who identifies with a particular group, Mexican, Dominican, Puerto Rican, Guatemalan, and so on, there's at least 23 different Hispanic and Latino groups in the United States as we know it. And that opportunity when someone identifies with a specific culture starts to give us insight as to how we can interact specifically, because these different groups are kind of fall under the umbrella terms of Hispanic Latino, have a lot of their own specific cultural nuances. Although there's similarities across all of them, they, at least the specific group that they identify with gives us, starts to give us direction in terms of the approaches we use. Some other terms that you may have seen or should start to be familiar with, and you can see there it says Latin with the @ sign. The attempt there was to use the word Latino, which usually has a gender-specific reference. Latino is used to kind of speak to either male Hispanics or male and female Hispanics. When you hear the word Latina, it's specific to the female gender. Here, the way it's written, it's an attempt to be inclusive. And one of the more recent terms that we're hearing and it's being used, and more by the millennials than anyone else, is Latinx. It's another attempt to just be gender neutral and not be specific one way or another. So as we go forward, what you'll find is that Joe and I will use these terms interchangeably, and we typically, when we present or train, even face-to-face, we ask folks to just to use the one they're comfortable with, or just simply ask the participants that you work with.
Okay, so why don't we take a look at some of the statistics of Latinos in criminal justice. As you can see from this slide, some studies have identified really unequal treatment for Latinos in the criminal justice system. Latinos are given significant higher bail amounts than their white counterparts for similar charges, which then result in longer incarceration periods for Hispanics due to their inability to post bail. Latinos are also less likely to be ROR'd or offered or are eligible for pre-trial release. Next slide. This slide provides us with a quick glimpse of the minority population in the U.S. Studies have shown that in a short amount of time, the minority population has grown from 46 million to 56.5 million. This growth is further proof that the need for more culturally competent treatment is essential. The millennial generation continues to grow at a rapid pace and seem to be much more acculturated than the previous generation. When we're talking about, let me get to the next slide, unmet needs for substance abuse. Take a look at these numbers. 95.8% felt that they didn't need treatment. This can be due to the lack of education or understanding on how substance abuse can impact the individual and family, which can be greatly due to linguistic challenges or issues. 2.2% felt that they didn't need treatment, that they needed treatment, but really didn't apply any effort to that. And 2% felt that they needed treatment and made an effort. So obtaining treatment poses many challenges, right? Many have limited or no access to treatment, right? They are unaware on how to access services. They have no medical insurance. Discussing the problems or struggles with people or strangers sort of in the Hispanic culture brings shame and embarrassment to the family. There's also, in many states, a lack of Spanish-speaking treatment. And we see more and more the absence of effective community strategies to help diminish cultural barriers and promote the use of culturally appropriate evidence-based practices within treatment.
So regarding the linguistic challenges, think about linguistic barriers for this population, for the Hispanic Latino population, in terms of accessing counsel. So think about the 56.5 million folks that Joe just referred to. You know, there are at least 33 million, according to the studies, according to some of the current research, at least 33 million actually speak English proficiently. That still leaves a whole 23 million who are not quite as well versed. Now, if they can't communicate well, and think about someone who's speaking English and is trying to communicate what the expectation, what the offer is, how they can accept the plea, and understanding all the nuances behind the court process. If they're not understanding how to communicate, how can they convey their concerns or convey that they do understand? So it really encourages us to consider ways to be a little bit more comprehensive in terms of how we interact with it to ensure that they do understand. The concern here is that even though a Hispanic, just imagine someone who speaks English, who seems to speak English well. The idea here is that just because someone speaks English well enough, and this is what the research is showing, does not necessarily mean that the comprehension correlates with the ability to speak English. So this is a collectivist society. A lot of the information that is processed cognitively is relational. It's not necessarily correlating with communication in English if someone doesn't have a good grasp of the English language. So one of the things that, there's a couple of studies that were out there, an examination of 35 states found that 46% failed to require that interpreters be provided in all civil cases. And there was another 37% that failed to use credentialed interpreters, which we know how challenging it is, but to not use them because there's so many laws that can be broken in terms of that. So think about, there was one situation where it really showed that the linguistic issues were really critical in terms of ensuring one situation in California where fair deliberations looked at 8 out of 10 California cases that they were settled with the offender not understanding that no contest is an actual admission of guilt. One of the things that we always suggest for folks who are working with Hispanic or Latino clients or drug court participants, whether or not you are a Hispanic or Latino background person, is to use some of the more common counseling one-on-one basics, like paraphrasing and summarizing and asking your client to convey back to you, to retell you the information that you just told them so you can ensure that there is comprehension. And sometimes we get caught up in our work, and sometimes we don't tend to do that.
So let's take a closer look at cultural and linguistic challenges in drug courts. You know, the linguistic issues play an important role in each of these points of contact that you see on the screen. Let's take a look at arrest. You know, being culturally competent and being able to communicate with Latinos effectively and understand certain cultural norms can be useful in de-escalating potential and high-risk situations and behaviors. When we're looking at working with counsel or attorneys in drug courts, you know, we're talking about really communication here. You know, many times you may have a Spanish-speaking attorney, but is it the correct dialect? Are they able to fully understand? Do they fully understand what's happening? They're asked to sign a plea agreement. Do they fully understand what that plea entails, what the expectations are of them, what the consequences are of them if they choose to take the plea, and what the drug court protocols are? So I'll give you a personal example. When I was the director for Brooklyn Treatment Court, and I also oversaw the DWI court, which had a lot of Hispanics, the Hispanic population come in, and you know, alcohol is sort of a norm within that culture. And one of the requirements to participate in DWI court was that you are not to consume alcohol or be around alcohol. They were expected to wear a SLAM bracelet, which was an alcohol monitoring bracelet. And what that bracelet did was not only did it pick up if there was any use, but it also picked up if they were around it, which we call an environmental alert. So that wasn't correctly communicated on several occasions, and it wasn't really understood that not only couldn't they drink, but they also couldn't be in a bar. They also, couldn't be at some certain family functions if there was alcohol present. So that's just a clear example. Let's take a look at the court process. Being part or trying to navigate the court process is hard for someone even if English is their first language. You're being asked to pay certain fines, to go to several offices. You may be asked to report to probation on a specific day and a certain time, and you're getting all of these instructions, and being able to fully understand that and navigate the court system can really be challenging. Just to jump to, let's take a look at the forms. Understanding the forms that they're signing. Most drug courts or problem-solving courts have what we call participation agreement forms that they sign in court. Those are very, very specific to the drug court, and it really outlines, expectations month by month. Are they fully understanding that? Do they have the correct interpreter? If you look at the court personnel piece, I tend to think of court officers in this piece. Court officers are usually the ones who are throwing instructions at people who enter the courtroom. Don't sit in the first row of the courtroom. Don't enter into the well. If a client's being remanded, placing your hands behind your back. If those instructions are not clearly communicated, that increases the risk for some type of outburst, or it could be interpreted to the court as resistance. Screening and assessment, again, having Latino, Spanish-specific assessments and evaluations are critical, and that there's no misinterpretations. Misinterpretations or misinformation can cause a misdiagnosis and an inappropriate placement in a treatment program. So again, this further supports the importance of cultural competence and cultural linguistics. Probation, we spoke about, just you're being told that you have to do certain things and show up in certain places. Understanding that you're going to be providing a urine toxicology, a supervised urine toxicology. All that really needs to be communicated. To effectively deliver culturally competent treatment services, part of what works for the Hispanic culture is involving family members, showing respect, just as it's being received. Respect traditional healing approaches and encourage asking of questions. Many challenges that prevent or delay participation are, long waits to get into a Spanish-speaking program. Those that are in public housing have a fear of losing public housing, because in some states, if you're in treatment program or you have an arrest charge that's pending, that's automatically you can lose your housing for that. Fear of losing custody of their children, fear of deportation if they're undocumented. Many Latinos are very spiritual, and many programs are not. So really beginning to start to focus on encouraging support of discussion of spirituality. So it's important to understand how culture can impact the treatment process. And we'll go a little on. We really touched on interpreters already, the importance of having not only a Spanish-speaking interpreter, but one that has the same dialect. We spoke about the importance of translating forms. Most times the court forms are in English and not and probably 99.9% of the time are not translated correctly. Taking a look at the judge. The judge must be educated on Hispanic culture. Alcohol is the cultural norm, and therefore, most Latinos don't view this as a drug or as a problem. So in drug court, this can result in numerous sanctions that may be imposed, and many times it takes several infractions before it finally clicks in that, alcohol cannot be used. MIS, which is Management Information System and Data Collection, and I think Diana spoke about that. When gathering data, going in a little deeper, not only how do you identify, I identify as Hispanic, what group of Hispanic, whether it's Puerto Rican, whether it's Dominican, whether it's Mexican, and that goes, and those questions are rarely asked, and that's not just with the Hispanic culture, that's with the African American culture. So really getting a firm understanding. Most of us in school are taught you need to complete a full thorough, whether it's a biopsychosocial assessment or a full type of assessment, but it's humorous that these questions aren't asked. So these are just really some things where improvements need to be made. So let's take a look. Let's look at this issue from a different angle. So here we have a picture of a girl who gets this phrase tossed at her. You don't speak Spanish? So I'm wondering what your thoughts are here. So I would ask you to please type in your response. What are your thoughts when you see this picture? I'll wait.
Type into the chat box.
Thank you.
Okay.
You don't speak Spanish. What comes to mind?
Amanda said that they need to find a translator.
Okay.
Sure.
Find the translator. Stereotype. Thanks, Jemmy. Any others? So what's happening here is, people are making the assumption that because she's Spanish, she should absolutely speak Spanish. Now, there's a term for that, and we're going to get to that in a little bit, but I want you to take a look at the next slide, or the next picture. Here's a picture of a young man who describes his experience while giving a speech. What thoughts come to mind? And here's the speech. And here's the image. When I gave a speech about racism,
the MC.
Thank you. The MC introduced me as Jamie Garcia. My name is Jamie Rodriguez. Not all Latinos have the last name Garcia. Again, what thoughts come to mind? Take a moment, type it into the Q&A box. Thank Alicia Young, not looking at people as individuals. Great. Thanks, Alicia. Amanda, someone is stereotyping. Absolutely. Can I get one more? We got 40 people on. Give me one more. Oh, Jemmy, cultural ignorance. Thanks, Jemmy. Right, so really what this is saying is because he's Hispanic, it's assumed that his last name is most likely and probably Garcia. Let's take a look at this, which is the last interactive slide that I'm going to ask you to do. Please take a look at this. This young woman has been asked this question, what are you? What thoughts come to mind when you hear that?
And her response.
And her response is, being biracial doesn't make me a what? Couple thoughts. Amanda? What? Seriously, who? Love it.
Definitely.
Thanks, Amanda. insensitive. Great. Can I get one more? She is not an object, she is a person. Excellent. You know, many times people say these type of statements without realizing that they are doing it, and they're insulting and they're degrading. These type of statements are known as, everyone jot it down, microaggressions, which Diana will speak a little bit about in a few minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So all these folks speak to the microaggressions, which are based on implicit bias. And implicit bias is based on attitudes and assumptions and belief systems that may have come from personal experiences, social learning for sure, and other associations that create typically unconscious bias. So that really means, it really just speaks to that some folks are not necessarily aware. You know, explicit bias is when it's overt, when it's obvious, when a person is aware. But implicit bias often, you know, consequently results in stereotypical and differential treatment. It can look like the photos Joe just showed us, or a lot of different ways that you could probably think of yourself. Essentially, microaggressions towards the drug court participant, you know, can't really impact their ability to, what we say, comply to. But I think I prefer to say it can certainly impact their ability to incite motivation on their part, so they can see the benefits that drug court actually has to offer. Drug court and treatment has a lot of opportunities that unfortunately kind of comes up against that cultural wall. So from the participant perspective, they experience stereotypical treatment. And a lot of practitioners are not aware that this is what they typically go through. So thinking of it from a power, let me just say that these everyday verbal, nonverbal, environmental snubs, insults, whether they're intentional or unconscious, they do communicate hostility, derogatory statements, and it's typically targeted to persons based solely on their membership with a marginalized community. So from a power privilege perspective, it speaks to unconscious insensitivity. And you folks were saying that when you were sharing your comments. You know, it may not seem like a big deal for the person who's saying it because it's just not that impactful for them. But what can happen is that what does happen is for the recipient, it is a heck of a big deal. So over time, this is what we see in our practice, in our settings. Over time, a person on the receiving end of these everyday type of experiences can lead these type of attacks, even if they don't seem like they're attacks, it can lead to depression, social isolation, certainly lower confidence. And you folks probably understand just how crucial that is, that can be when we're trying to incite motivation to change behavior. So this microaggressions actually have a macro impact. If counselors avoid or minimize the relevance of bias and discrimination and self-exploration, they will likely do the same in the assessment and counseling process. So this is what we're saying here is that it really is beneficial to effective practice if we take the time to self-assess. I am encouraging everyone to consider this not just a non-Hispanic practitioner, I mean everyone who works with Hispanic, any cultural group. Self-exploration helps to make one aware of your own bias, your own belief system. And one of the things that Joe and I have done is that when we've gone on and trained on this topic, that we're not necessarily saying you should change your way of thinking. It would be nice, but I'm not saying that. What we're saying is that understand what your belief system is. When you're aware of it, you have a better likelihood to be able not to allow it to be part of the interaction and the individualized or person-centered approaches and care that you that you should be giving your program participants. So understanding how important that is will help you do the same thing when you're doing assessments, when you're doing the counseling process, and it just makes you aware that it doesn't impact on any other domains or any other processes that you engage with the client with.
Okay, so you'll probably notice by now that language tends to be a reoccurring theme. That's because it's probably one of the biggest barriers right now. And I'll just, I guess, repeat myself. You know, language is so key in serving the Hispanic population and ensuring that they're getting their due process. How do we ensure someone's rights if they can't fully understand what's happening at that moment? Another barrier is immigration, the issue of being undocumented. You know, at least in New York, it's very hard to obtain services for individuals that are undocumented. They have no medical insurance. They have fear of being deported, especially these days, which results in individuals really not being forthcoming with their information during the assessment process. Now, again, if the assessment process is happening on a drug court level and they're not being forthcoming, and that comes out some way down the road, that's viewed as, from a court's perspective, as someone who wasn't really engaged fully within the recovery process. Gender-specific issues with substance abuse, you know, it's interesting that Hispanic families tend to accept Latinos more so having a substance abuse issue than Latinas who are usually looked down upon for their substance abuse use. You know, attitudes, the Latinos' attitudes and defiance, sometimes also known as machismo, may encourage or reinforce the drug use. You know, Latinx, which is that new term that we just learned, is used to describe both male and female of Latin descent, gender neutral. Acculturation issues can induce or exacerbate mental health issues. Stresses related to leaving their home and trying to integrate into the U.S. culture can cause stress. Economic issues can cause stress. Housing issues. You know, so levels of acculturation do impact treatment planning. Assessing for acculturation issues is really key in culturally informed treatment. Let's take a look at minority stress. Minority stress refers to the high levels of stress experienced by persons of a stigmatized minority group. It refers to the tensions that minorities encounter resulting from racism, assimilation for Latinos who have attempted to integrate themselves into a dominant culture have high levels of stress. Some explanation may be, you know, because of lower socioeconomic status, being exposed to higher rates of violence. Minority stress can cause considerable anxiety and depression as a result of discrimination. So here we have some interesting statistics and facts that I'm going to read directly from the slide because I think it's important. Women with a co-occurring disorder are incarcerated and remain in jail significantly longer than those individuals who are not diagnosed with a co-occurring disorder. Hispanics or Latinos are less likely than whites to receive needed mental health treatment. 1 out of 15 Hispanics who suffer from depression is not able to get medical help. That's one too many. There are higher rates of mental illness among U.S.-born Latinos and long-term residents than American Latino immigrants. Trauma-informed care with Latinos. Trauma-informed care, which most of you on this call, I'm sure, are familiar with, is an approach to engage people with histories of trauma that recognize the presence of trauma and acknowledge the role that trauma plays in someone's life. Most organizations now take what we call the trauma-informed approach, or a universal approach to trauma, where we assume that everyone that comes through our doors or everyone that we come in contact with has had some exposure to some type of violence. Latinos may be very reluctant to discuss trauma due to issues of machismo. Trauma can be seen as a sign of weakness or defeat. It's important that all agencies and organizations really take a trauma-informed approach. That way, everyone is getting a full and thorough trauma assessment.
So, Just to build a little bit into generational views and building on what Joe said, a lot of times the school of thought back in the day was that Hispanic and more the older generations or the first or second generations in this country, Hispanic and Latinos often were reluctant or to even talk about any mental health issues, trauma, or anything. They kind of tend to keep a lot of this information within the family. They're not very forthcoming because that's not the kind of thing that you offer to folks, to practitioners anywhere. That's kept in the family, and sometimes because of not having that information or understanding of some of the issues that have to do with mental health, you're not understanding that we're talking about neurological, biological-based issues, then folks sometimes used to think that it has something to do with them personally, and it's not necessarily the type of subject that they offer to just any practitioner. So the school of thought is actually changing these days. For younger Latinos who are more acculturated and have more in-depth knowledge of some of the where mental health comes from and what it is, there's a higher likelihood that they access, or actually not a high likelihood, they actually do access mental health services a lot more than the older counterparts. So here's the thing, though. Think about this. When you think about the median age of your drug court participant or the folks you have in treatment, if you think about, like with me, with my client population, it used to be anywhere between 38 and 40. And I know that number, I think, hasn't it gotten older in the drug court? It's older, it's like 45, 50. Yeah. So it's like we have folks coming in and out. So we haven't always been able to be the most effective in terms of communicating and getting past the barrier for some of our participants in terms of letting them understand or informing them as to what is the nature of some of these mental health issues. And actually trying to engage in assessing for or just soliciting information about what is their understanding on what they believe they're going through can help engage them, and it's a wonderful opportunity to inform them on options available, giving them a little bit of education on maybe the particular mental health issues that they may have, the symptoms they may exhibiting, the ways where they can mitigate them. You know, so it's actually a great opportunity to engage in some really informative conversation with them. That alone is a great way to build rapport, and really, when they tend to hear information that's not necessarily information that they think they can personalize, a lot of times they find out there's more information behind this. It's not about a certain weakness on their part. They're actually more engaged and more open and receptive to options that you can provide them.
So, Diana, you know, I'm wondering, you know, what do you think the reason is behind this newer generation, and I'm assuming we're talking about millennials, that they're more open to receiving mental health services or are more familiar with these type of services that are out there versus the older generations where there's a lot more resistance and there's a lot more fear of the services that are available?
Well, acculturation really has played a big part with this. When you figure that the first and older generations brought their culture with them, and they are trying to live within the existence of the larger American culture, and not necessarily acculturated, not necessarily English proficient, not necessarily being able to access the specific information that helps them get engaged with mental health. You do find those opportunities with young, I was going to say younger generations, but it's actually the second, third, and fourth generations, those folks who are more likely to maybe keep or adhere to some of the cultural characteristics that they're raised with, but they're also exposed and are acclimating to the dominant culture, the American culture. So they're more exposed to the education. And there's a lot of Latinos now that are more educationally based. It's always been a primary focus with the Hispanic population, but the younger generations have the opportunity to actually, you know, interact and
be a part of that.
Oh, yeah. And so they're exposed to this information, so they're more open to accepting, and they're not necessarily looking at it as a weakness, and like some of the more traditional views.
Right.
So it's helpful. It's really helpful to understand.
Yeah.
So the research is starting to show that the outlook is changing. Some of us, one of the things it's really important to understand that the research has been limited over the years. We have been able to understand, different scientists have put together and identified cultural values, characteristics amongst the population. And some of these are listed here. And what speaks to the different generational views from the previous slide is that these values here, they overlap, they're adhered to at different levels, and so if you put in there acculturation, you put in there adherence to American values, American cultural values,
right,
while also blending in and living from the Hispanic and Latino cultural values, you start to see that there's more information out there, there's more accessibility to certain things.
Right.
But here's the thing, you have to understand just how they adhere to it. It depends on the individual. So these are more of the themed out characteristics of the population. So family's always been a big deal with the Hispanic population.
Sure.
We've seen that with other groups as well, but let's put it within the context of this population, this community. Family in terms of, it's also referred to as familism in research. When you read them, this is where it comes from. So family is an essential part of identity. It's essential to identity for any Hispanic or Latino person. And it's a source of support, it's a source of strength, it's your support system, it's where you get, it's where you go to problem solve. Family is such a big deal. It really impacts on how many people within any one of these Latino communities, how they interact with one another. It impacts on how they make decisions, how one person makes a decision and how it relates or impacts the rest of the members of the family. That is consideration. So this kind of speaks back to my first point where communication and the cognitive processes, don't necessarily align in a linear manner because cognitively there's more relational processing going on. So family, it's really about, if I'm living in a unit, whatever I do, I've got to consider, how is it going to impact my brothers and sisters? Am I taking care of, do we have an aunt that we already are taking care of and she's got maybe some certain health issues? What do our parents think about it? What does the grandparents think about it?
Extended family is very important too within that.
That's where the newer, I guess it's not as new anymore, but as the newer version or the newer definition of family is the compadre, the godparents, the family friend for many, many, many years. That's family. And if that person has an issue where we have families where they have to take somebody under their wing, give them house, they come into the house, they give them that kind of support. If they have to take care of somebody, well, they're not as likely to send them to a hospital if they can take care of them at home. That's the same type of support that they would give, not just to the parent, the nuclear family members, but to that long-term family friend.
And I think that's where treatment providers fall short when they're trying to engage the client in treatment. They're not really taking into account the family and the family support and bringing the entire family into the process.
Yeah, and there's opportunity for that, particularly when we're talking about, somebody was asking about adolescents, and what the interventions that have been seen most effective are family therapeutic interventions. It's because that's a support system. It's a little bit more in depth than that because you have to consider developmental issues or the stage of development they're at, and plus what services are they structured around, adolescent-specific development, or are they dumbed-down interventions that were created or developed for adults, which usually are not as effective. But we'll go into that just a few more in a few minutes. Let me just talk about these, especially these first three. Think about the gender role expectations that Hispanic populations have. Sometimes we look at these and we think about, oh, that's how it used to be, generations ago. Well, it's not necessarily so. Being the man, the manhood in terms of Hispanic population, the value, what we refer to as machismo, it is so specific and transcends so many communities. American culture refers to machismo all the time. It speaks to the man being the provider, the protector, the head of the family,
decision maker.
The last word on decisions that are made, And so that's the person who's supposed to be protecting the family. That's the person who's supposed to have the last word and makes decisions for the family and decides where are we going to move, how much are we going to spend here and there. Think about the woman, I would say counterpart, but it's not necessarily equal. So womanhood in the Hispanic population, or in this culture, rather, is hembrism, Marianism. Hembrism speaks to womanhood. Think about the sweet 16s that we have in American culture, and the coming out of a woman, of a young woman. She's being presented to society. Well, when a person comes out, the sweet 16 for Hispanic populations is 15 years of age, and that speaks to her being now able to have all the multiple responsibilities, in her household. See, the woman is the head of the household. She makes sure it's clean. She got the food on the table. She takes the kids to school. The kids are sick. She takes them to school. Their homework is done. The bills are paid because she makes sure that all that is taken care of. And she's probably holding down either a career or a part-time job along with that. So there are so many of these different aspects of cultural values. I just want to give you an example. I'm going to give you an example of one, because I want to keep within our time frame. So I have two examples here. So you tell me, because I want to get your take on this too. I'm going to go with the second one, because someone asked me about adolescence. But a young Latino male, now we're talking about someone who's 18 actually. So it's not really an adolescent, it's supposed to be a young adult. But a young Latino male, this is our actual real case study, scenario that happened with a friend of mine who happens to be a legal aid at Bronx County Court. So she met this young man who presented to court for, possession. Apparently he was dealing, and it wasn't his first time in the criminal justice system. So she met him in court along with his mother, his wife, and his sister. All of them lived together in the same house. One of the things he did with the drugs, or with the drug money, was that he helped to pay the bills. So she met his family. She met the legal aid representative, met him, and then he introduced her to the other three women. So every time they came up and met at the courthouse, she would meet the wife, the mother, and the sister. And that happened at least 4 times that they had to appear before the court. Now, on the 5th time that they appeared before the court, my colleague actually saw only the young male, who was the young offender. And she was very surprised. At first she thought it was great to have that kind of support, that he didn't at least have to go through this process by himself, that they were there in his life and they were giving him that kind of support. And what he told her, she asked, where were they? And he had told her, well, I don't want them here, because when that sentence comes down, it's going to kill them. They need it, and I don't want them to go through that with me.
Right.
So what do you think about that? What does that tell you? I mean, he did sell drugs. He's getting ready to be sentenced. Apparently he took a plea. So what do you think about that? Give me your 1 or 2 words as to what you think that is.
Love.
Yeah, definitely love. Okay.
Thanks, respect.
Okay, respect. Think about the cultural values that I just told you about in terms of the machismo, in terms of how important family is. So this is what we mean by using a cultural lens. See, typically when you look at a case like that, it's like, okay, he sold drugs, he got busted, he's going to do time. He's offended before, and so he's going to go upstate, and there's going to be some prison time. This is not jail. So. But if you think about the cultural characteristics of the Hispanic community, this young person was actually taking care of his family. He may have been selling drugs, the importance of providing for family. That's exactly right. He was using the machismo characteristics as part of his role responsibility. Granted, it wasn't legal. He wasn't even going to school, but he was making a lot of money. And that's how he took care of the women in his life.
And I also think, Diana, just to add on that, he was also protecting them by not wanting them to attend that sentencing.
I was just going to talk about that. Oh. One of the reasons there's also a thing, he was trying to protect them from that traumatic experience. that trauma experience is part of him protecting. So we talked about, I discussed and offered, the different aspects and nuances of being macho or machismo person, and that speaks to his way of fulfilling that role. Yet from the court perspective, us as practitioners, we're looking at someone just presenting illegal activity, and he was going to do time for the crime.
And that family didn't show up because they didn't want to have anything to do with him. That's the perspective
exactly right. Sure. Exactly right. So cultural competence versus cultural humility. We started to hear cultural humility for a long time. Actually, Joe and I have been presenting this under a different term, but here's what cultural competency and what the lay of the land seems to speak about that. It implies that one person can function with a thorough knowledge of the other beliefs of another culture, like one person can know everything about another culture. While cultural humility speaks to acknowledging that it is impossible to adequately be knowledgeable about cultures other than one's own. It is impossible for any one practitioner to know everything about anybody at any time. So what we're talking about here really speaks to, it's a process, it's not a destination. Cultural humility has to do with understanding and developing a process-oriented approach to competency. You can get to competency if you actively engage in an ongoing process of understanding your biases, of making sure that you elicit information from that specific person, understand that there are strengths in those values in that list that I just showed that folks adhere to, and use that to integrate that and individualize a treatment plan. So it does speak to a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique, and it looks to be more of a partner with your core participant to incite motivation, to use that as a way to facilitate recovery for them. Sure. So I'm going to ask you folks to do one more thing. Can you look at this picture? And I just love this picture. Do you think this is, this perspective, is it cultural? Two images there are looking at the exact same thing. One person sees 4, another person sees 3. Give me 1 or 2 words of what you think. Is this cultural, yes or no? That's an easy type in. Yes.
Thanks, Dustin.
And we got a maybe. So this is what I want to say about that. If I stand on one side of looking at a chair, I'm going to see that chair from this side. If I stand on the other side, I'm going to see the same chair, but I'm going to see it from a different angle. And culture is about that. Culture has to do with your belief system, what your resources are. Perspective can be different depending on your lens. That's exactly right. The whole point of using a cultural lens is at least it'll help you see the client better. And these images kind of speak to it. But this other one is really neat too. So look at this one. So here we have the blonde in a bikini, and with her sunglasses, and her thinking is everything covered by her eyes. What a cool male-dominated culture. And you see a woman in seemingly Muslim garb who's looking over her and thinking nothing covered but her eyes. What a cool and male-dominated culture. This is almost the same thing. So what we want to say here is you can be feeling the same way, having the same viewpoint, and it's actually different. So it really behooves us, it really is encouraging for us to consider being more culturally informed, more recovery-based and inclusive when in our language, in our communication, and how we interact with our drug court participants. So if you've been to the National Center of Cultural Competence, where they're one of the first entities that have spoken to that understanding the dynamics involved in this cultural humility process that has you, that encourages us to build our own self-awareness, that speaks into our attitudes, build knowledge, understand who's your target population you're working with, get some extra information, so at least that can start to guide the kind of questions that you will ask, and also the skill sets in how you're going to interact. So culturally informed modality includes these cultural assessments, and there's a whole array of these. You can do it individually and organizationally, and you can find these all in the National Center of Cultural Competence. So integrating a cultural approach includes this. You ask culturally informed questions, like who's the decision maker in your house? How do you see your role as a woman in the family? what do you think, or where do you see, one of the things we used to ask our adolescents, and many entities that actually encourage this is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? What do you, and who do you see in your life at that time? So we're listening to identify the cultural values that they adhere to. Do you see machismo in there? Do you see spirituality in there? And understand, spirituality, we tend to think with the Hispanic and Latino population is religious-based. It's not necessarily so. The three primary religions that are adhered to within all of these cultural communities tend to be either Roman Catholic, Pentecostal, or evangelical. And then you have the non-denomination belief system. I will also encourage you that a lot of folks who are in recovery have taken a spiritual perspective that does not necessarily include, that does include a higher power, but does not always necessarily include that. You have to understand one extra thing, that there is, the support system has this, this connection, the spiritual connection from the interpersonal connections that folks have with other people who are in the same process as them. That's huge. That in and of itself can be very spiritual. And we see that lately with a lot of Hispanics in treatment and in drug court. So when you assess for what cultural values they adhere to, look at the strengths within there, the resiliencies, the resourcefulness, include that within your treatment plan. Integrate the cultural strengths within the context of promoting behavior change. So that means you understand the cultural stresses that led to drug use and the impact, and provide them options for change to actually highlight their values, inciting their innate motivation and more.
Okay, so sanctions and incentives. Sort of the foundation of drug court, right? This is what drug courts are built on. This is what makes us unique. This is what makes us, therapeutic. So what are culturally informed sanctions and incentives? Do they exist? When we talk about administering culturally informed sanctions and incentives, what we're really saying is understand who your client is. Practice cultural competence and cultural humility, but understand who your client is. Most drug courts each morning, they have what are called staffings, where the team gets together. It's usually case managers, it's treatment, it's psychiatry. They all get together and they go over who's on the calendar for that day and who is scheduled or may possibly be receiving a sanction, and who's on the list to receive some sort of assessment and reward. It's at that time that a cultural lens really needs to be used, especially when it comes to sanctions. They really need to look at the person through a cultural lens to see what's going to be most impactful to induce that behavior change. So, for example, if we're talking about incentives from a cultural perspective, family time is extremely important in the Hispanic culture. So one type of an incentive may be a day at the movies with family. So maybe the judge sort of gives out movie tickets. Verbal praise and applause that happens within the courtroom. For Latinos, this can have a huge impact, and that's due to the passive role that they usually play within their marriage and in the family. So acknowledgement like this provides a sense of accomplishment, provides a sense of independence. In terms of sanctions, again, it's all about knowing your client. If your client is going to be remanded, the team at that time during the staffing, while looking through a cultural lens, should discuss and make appropriate arrangements if needed, if someone is going to be remanded. So, for example, if someone needs some type of mental health issue, some type of mental health treatment while incarcerated, those arrangements should be made. Any type of religious observance, those types of arrangements need to be made if someone is going to be incarcerated for a period of time. And I'm speaking in terms of drug courts, so keep in mind drug courts can remand someone for a day or can remand someone for 17 days, so it really depends on the judge. But as we all know, jail-based sanctions should be used as a last resort, but this sort of poses a challenge. So, I mean, there are many other sanctions that drug courts impose on clients, but here's the problem when it comes to working with Hispanics that have a difficult time. Many times we'll increase treatment or case management visits in lieu of jail as a sanction. This can pose a huge issue, especially if the Latino or Latina is a primary wage earner within the family. Another sanction we'll use is journal or essay writing. Again, can be a huge issue if there's difficulty with the English language. We work a lot from workbook assignments and exercises, which can be used as a sanction. Complete, this chapter of this particular evidence-based curriculum, and then come back next week, and we're going to talk about that in court. Problem is, most workbooks are not in Spanish, so that can pose another issue. So, these challenges reinforce the importance that change really needs to take place within the criminal justice system. So, I look at it as, without intention, of course, the system, in a way, is designed to use jail as one of the only possible sanctions for Latinos and Hispanics because the other ones have so many challenges. So what's the easy thing to do is to remand them for 3 days. For 3 days. Again, it's more evidence that we're not doing enough to serve the Hispanic population in the criminal justice system. Culturally informed strategies. Questions that, culturally informed assessments can lead to effective communication, resources, and referrals. Here we go back to questions that go more in depth than just how do you identify a Hispanic, African American. We need to elaborate more on those types of questions that focus on culture and cultural norms and practices. This will then assist the treatment provider in really getting a better understanding of who that person is in front of them and what type of needs that they present with, and also be able to connect them to appropriate culturally competent services if needed.
Oh,
that's you.
This is me.
That's you.
So, so let's talk about a couple of things here. So when we talk about culture, and I want you to consider that the cultural characteristics that do play a part with anybody that you serve. I discussed, or I mentioned earlier, that understanding how an individual adheres to these values, or finds it important enough that they practice it in your life is important. When it comes to Hispanic youth, we have other challenges. We cannot take the same approach that we do with the adult offenders in our drug courts. Can't do that because it's not going to work. And maybe that's why we see such a high turnover of practitioners in juvenile justice. It really encourages us to understand the human development process and developmental stages and tasks that different youth go through. So if you're thinking of like an interaction with practitioners, it's not unusual that you get an attitude from a young man who may not understand what you're coming from, or is thinking, you're thinking that they might be defiant, and all of a sudden they're acting like they're reflecting or they're showing off their machismo and who they are. Well, a lot of times it has to do with what we're asking them to do. Is it within the developmental stage that they're in? That has a lot to do with what's important in their life. When we look at it from a risk and protective factor perspective, what is the ecological world that they come from? Who are the most important people in their life? Are their parents using? Are their parents not available because they're out working and providing? Both sides or other different other reasons for the adults who not to be around can certainly impact on their ability to continue to develop, in a way where they feel they're loved, where they're cared, where they're supported. So one of the things about adolescents, a really big major thing, while their bodies are going through changes and why they are they're in this stage where they're experiencing a lot, and peer pressure, peer is really important. So experimenting with drugs is not unusual. What we find is a lot of these youth who do come into our programs don't think they have a substance use problem. We don't have to push to get them to admit they have a problem. We do have to understand that in their world at that time where they're at, it's not necessarily the most effective approach in interactions with them. So while the research surrounding children from diverse Latino cultures and data of these children and their families, it kind of delineates a pretty discouraging picture for Latinos sometimes, but they overlook the resiliency and the strength that youth bring. Every youth has a way of dealing with their problems to the best of their ability. And, and they use what they have in their world. And, feeling cared about the family is really huge. One of the advancements that prevention has taken in this country, for instance, if you look at young women, if you look at the young women with pregnancy rates are were really huge for the Hispanic population, for Latinas. Now, pregnancy rates overall in this country have declined substantially. But the Latina continues to have the highest rates of pregnancy, in this country. And a lot of times it's done intentionally. They get pregnant because they're not getting the love they need from their families. They are brought up with family as being such an important unit, a part of who they are, and when they're not getting their needs met, and we've had a lot of research that speaks to these young women getting pregnant on purpose. And then you have the other side also that has the young women who, why is it that we have so much information, accessibility to prevention? We have it to, using barriers during sex, to using pills, birth control. There is accessibility, and you don't necessarily have to be 18 for it. So why is it that we have high pregnancy rates with Latinas and it's still not getting this message? So maybe we need to look at it from a cultural lens and understand just how important the other values are, because a lot of times that impedes their ability to access some of these prevention efforts, initiatives that we have. So some of the most resilient support system that you can make sure you get for them is, feeling cared about their family. If their family is not the most functional one, not necessarily the support system that is healthy for them, but accessing a support system for them, whether it's with peers or in another setting, something that speaks to who they are. Is it in the community faith-based agency? Is it in other, extracurricular activities with sports and community centers and things of that nature? Getting them engaged with other folks. Oh, now I messed up that slide. Hold on. So, excuse me a second. Let me get back here. All right. So, feeling connected to school is really important because we know we have to emphasize and reinforce and support how important education is. Having caring adults to turn to with problems. If the parents are not available, the mentorship programs have proven so effective.
Absolutely.
Right? We have the mentorship for the Veterans Court. We have certified peer recovery coaches and certified peer advocates in treatment programs across the country. So this is hugely impactful for our young folks as well. They're having supportive friends with positive social values. What you find is when you have a young person who is associated with other Hispanics and Latinos, other Hispanic and Latinos who are engaged in sports, who are engaged in social activities, and who are engaged in the community and advocating, or engaged in perhaps, some of these mentorship programs, you'll find that you can connect some of our young folks with these programs, and that reinforces their ability to go in a different direction, to give them options, to feel hopeful. See, you also have to consider that the youth are in a really malleable stage because it's not set in place. It's a little different than some of the adults that we've seen come in and out of the programs in our treatment, drug court and treatment programs. Yep. And they are more in a place where they can be redirected. Sure. But the interventions and the approaches really need to be specific to this population.
So, final slide, and let's talk about evidence-based practices. There are many evidence-based practices. There are many evidence-based practices that have been translated into to Spanish. However, there are also many that have not been translated into Spanish.
Yeah.
SAMHSA, has this great translation kit on their website that's available, so take note of that. It's really important to be able to translate these evidence-based practices accurately in order to keep with the fidelity of the model that you're translating. But it's important to also be able, to use it culturally. And it can be done. It can be, you can keep the fidelity of the model while also using it from a cultural perspective.
Well, as a matter of fact, why don't you folks say what evidence-based practice do you know or you use are culturally adapted or culturally specific to the Hispanic Latino population that has seen effective with them? Type it in your chat box. We'd like to know what you're currently using, or at least what you're starting to use. Well, I know one that the most folks know about is that MI, right?
The MRT, there it is.
Okay.
MRT, absolutely. Yeah. MRT has a Spanish or a Spanish version. MRT is very popular, I say. It's a great program. It's translated accurately, and we got some others, motivational interviewing and seeking safety. Again, all these Spanish-specific evidence-based practices are available on the SAMHSA website.
Right. I like that. I appreciate that someone included in there seeking safety. Seeking safety has 6 specific principles, but one of the things I like so much about it is that it includes, really looks to being culturally specific, culturally and gender responsive, and also includes, the ability to, take into account the history of the person. And sometimes when we trying to be culturally informed in terms of our practice and engaging and trying to really increase the successful outcomes for our programs, we're talking about really being culturally informed, so trauma-informed care really aligns nicely with what we're speaking to here. A lot of these folks have gone through their own levels of trauma, and from a cultural perspective, when you think about the microaggressions that they tend to deal with, the minority stress that many of them live with and don't understand that they're living with. So a lot of folks do not understand, with the Hispanic and Latino community, don't understand that they're actually behaving and thinking and living in a way and adapting to the best of their ability to the world that they're in, not understanding that you have an opportunity to actually break through the barrier to engage them in that. So when somebody's kind of reserved, when someone's not as forthcoming, when someone seems to be in and out of the courts or in and out of the system, then it's your opportunity to be the one person or the one program that can engage them and and use a person-centered perspective to elicit, to understand who they are, how they are.
And help me understand what they've gone through.
Yeah, and then incorporate that within the program that you already have available. Anyway, we wanted to leave time. This is kind of mostly the end of the slide, but we certainly wanted to leave time for you folks to ask questions and answers. These are some references here. So this is a good time. Chat, pull in your questions and type them up, and we'll do our best to ask them.
Thanks, Diana and Joe. This is Anna Kuzman again with the Justice Programs Office for everyone tuning in. So feel free to submit your questions through either the chat box or the Q&A panel on the right side of your screen. So Tony asks, is there any cultural competence or humility evidence-based practices that relate to the Asian or Pacific Islander population that either of you might know of?
Yeah, it's interesting because Asian and Pacific Islanders, I think with the Filipino community, they kind of fall under that supposed category.
I don't, right.
Yeah, and they have a lot of values. A lot of the cultural nuances within those populations are very similar to the Hispanic and Latino population.
Right.
I think language is a big deal, and enlisted. I think the biggest takeaway point is to elicit information within your intake instruments and your assessment instruments and even your ASIs and all the other instruments you use to screen folks and diagnose, to ask cultural questions to understand what they think their problem is, to understand how specific it is to the world they come from. Because that's going to help them to comply a little bit easier to actually follow through.
One of the questions I always had my staff ask is, how does this presenting issue affect you within your life and your family? Because I can make my own assumptions about that just as a clinician, but hearing it from the client is really what you want to do. I'm not familiar with any Asian-specific evidence-based practices, but I would take a look at SAMHSA, but also, your own research. Google Scholar is great, and there's many resources out there to get information on the various cultures.
Yeah, and in that population too is also spirituality is a really big deal. Very holistic approaches into the way they live. So yeah, research on that specific population is really key. I think culture humility kind of applies to everyone.
Sure.
It's really about eliciting information that is specific to that person you're going to start working with. It can't apply to anyone that you work with, but it's really important because if you want them to succeed in the program, this is the best way is to get the information from them. Once you assess for your own biases, get that out of the way. Don't let that be part of the lens you use. And that way you can hear and understand where maybe one of your participants are coming from and tailor the interventions accordingly.
Great.
Any more questions?
I don't see any other questions coming in, so I think we'll choose to wrap up. So if you have any other questions that did not get answered during today's webinar, please feel free to send us an email at ndcrc@american.edu, and we can forward those on to Joe and Diana. And I also want to encourage you to check out the Resource Center website, Twitter, and our other Justice Programs Office social media accounts, which are all displayed on the screen. Oh, here's another question, actually. How do you deal with a team member who exhibits implicit bias?
Oh, you know what? It's funny because with implicit bias, it's also about self-assessing. Organizations can request or require practitioners to actually self-assess. So it doesn't necessarily have to be where one person is highlighted or identified, pointed out, so to speak, But in the organization, it might be an idea to get to the decision makers to ask that, that everybody required to do that.
Some type of cultural sensitivity training, maybe, which is required through, many organizations. But I mean, if whoever asked the question, if you're, feel that you want to, directly speak to this individual, my thought is, as a clinician, I'm always big on the I statement. So I've noticed that you've come across on, this way. I'm wondering if you're aware of that, and that usually gets the conversation going, and hopefully you'll be able to, resolve, or and it could very well be that other individual is not even having any acknowledgement that's even taking place.
Yeah, that's why the trainings are really important, and it's not a one-time deal. It's something they should do periodically.
Sure.
We get caught up in our routines and our styles and in our overwhelming responsibilities, and we kind of just get it kind of falls by the wayside. And so it's a really nice refresher to have periodically. If you go to the conferences, if you go to presentations, those are really helpful as well.
Right. Or send them a link to this presentation.
Yeah, that's right. You can do that.
Right.
In which we've been getting a lot of questions about how people can receive a copy of the slides and a copy of the recording of this webinar, and that will be emailed out to everyone who registered and attended this webinar early next week, and it will also be posted on both of the websites listed on your screen. And we also have a bunch of other recorded webinars and resources for you if you work in drug treatment court settings that you might find beneficial. So I think that's all the time that we have for today, but thank you, Joe and Diana, so much for preparing a great and informative webinar. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you for attending today.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.